More than 50 investors across the United States and abroad believed they were investing in something meaningful. Real estate renovations for church properties, Christian concerts overseas, a mission trip to Africa. Instead, federal prosecutors say they became victims in a fraud scheme that pulled in over $3.2 million. This is the story of the indictment against Richard Reynaldo Garcia, senior pastor of Gracia Church in Arlington, Texas, and how he allegedly used the trust of his congregation and of outside investors who had never even set foot in his church to build a scheme that ran for years behind the language of faith. Who is Richard Reynaldo Garcia? Garcia is 53, and he leads Gracia Church, based in Arlington. His reach, investigators say, went well past that single congregation. Additional ties to churches in Arlington and Mansfield gave him a footprint across multiple communities throughout North Texas, rather than influence confined to one building or one Sunday service. To the people who knew him, Garcia looked exactly like a trusted pastor should, someone building churches, someone funding mission work, someone offering faith-based investment opportunities to members of his community and to people well beyond it, all under the banner of ministry. A federal grand jury paints a very different picture of what was happening underneath that image. Garcia ran a scheme from August 2021 through April 2025, a stretch of nearly 4 years, funneling money from more than 50 victims through a network of church-linked entities. And none of that money, the indictment claims, was used the way he told investors it would be. The U.S. Attorney's Office for the Northern District of Texas announced the case, under U.S. Attorney Ryan Raybould, and a Fort Worth grand jury handed up the indictment, where the case is now being prosecuted. 4 years is a long run for a scheme like this one, and the length matters more than it might seem at first. It points to something bigger than a con that flares up and collapses within months. If the allegations hold up, this was an operation that persisted, adapted, and kept attracting new victims year after year, even while earlier investors were reportedly fed updates about projects that never existed. A short-lived scam relies on one big lie told once. 4 years of alleged fraud requires constant upkeep, constant reassurance, and a willingness to keep the story going long after the money should have produced real results. The entities behind the scheme. 3 organizations sat at the center of the alleged fraud, each one carrying a name that sounded exactly like a legitimate ministry or church support business: Ministerio Gracia, Gracia Church of Texas, and a limited liability company called A Pesar de Todo, LLC. Investors sent their money to these accounts believing they were funding real projects, and the names themselves did a lot of the work. They carried the weight of church infrastructure, the kind of accounts a faithful investor trusts, without asking many follow-up questions, simply because the label sounded like ministry business rather than a private financial vehicle. Prosecutors allege something else was going on underneath. Instead of legitimate ministry accounts, these entities functioned as the financial backbone of the fraud itself, pulling in victim funds and channeling that money toward purposes disconnected entirely from the renovations, concerts, or trips investors believed they were supporting. Spreading the money across 3 entities rather than routing everything through one account also bought the operation a layer of separation. Funds moving between Ministerio Gracia, Gracia Church of Texas, and A Pesar de Todo, LLC, could be described one way to one investor and another way entirely to the next, depending on which project each person believed they were funding. One investor might hear their money went toward the Arlington renovation. Another might be told it supported a concert venture in the Dominican Republic. And the underlying use of the money, the indictment claims, didn't necessarily match either story. The charges of federal grand jury indicted Garcia on 4 counts: conspiracy to commit wire fraud, 2 counts of wire fraud, and aggravated identity theft. Formal charges came down in early June 2026, following what appears to have been an extended investigation into the pattern described above. The exposure here is significant. Each wire fraud and conspiracy count carries up to 20 years in prison. Layered on top of that, the identity theft charge adds a separate mandatory 2-year sentence, and that sentence has to run consecutively, meaning it gets added on top of whatever else Garcia might be sentenced to, not served at the same time. It's worth being precise about where this case actually stands. Everything described here and everything that follows comes from allegations laid out in a federal indictment. Garcia has not been convicted of anything, and under the law, he's presumed innocent unless a court finds him guilty. An indictment on its own proves nothing. It simply reflects a grand jury's finding that probable cause exists to bring these charges forward. Trial is set for October in federal court in Fort Worth. How the alleged scheme worked. Church-flipping prosecutors point to a real estate model they call church flipping as one of the main engines behind the alleged fraud. Buy a church property, renovate it, resell it for a profit, split the proceeds among the people who funded the work. Nothing about that model is inherently illegitimate. Plenty of investors use that exact strategy successfully. What prosecutors allege is that Garcia took the framework and used it as cover for years, running the same basic script over and over without the underlying deals ever actually happening as described. Take one example from the indictment. Two investors put $50,000 into renovating and reselling a church property in Arlington, and Garcia later told them the project had returned a 55% profit, a hefty number by any measure, and that their money had already been rolled into a new project on their behalf. The investors never authorized any such reinvestment, and prosecutors allege almost none of what Garcia told them was true. No 55% profit, no reinvestment that actually took place. That same pattern resurfaces with a different investor and different properties. $293,000 moved across two separate transactions toward church properties in Texarkana and Lubbock, and Garcia allegedly recycled the same story, purchased, renovated, sold at a profit. None of it happened, according to prosecutors. No purchase, no renovation, no resale. Just a fabricated narrative, maintained carefully enough to keep the investor believing their money was still working towards something. What stands out most is how repeatable the pattern was. This isn't one lie told once to one unlucky victim. It's what prosecutors describe as a template Garcia reused again and again, swapping property names and dollar amounts while keeping the core structure intact. Solicit funds for a renovation, report a fabricated profit once enough time had passed, then either ask for more money or claim the funds had been rolled into something new and even more promising. That structure did real work for the scheme's longevity, since each fresh fabricated update gave investors one less reason to demand to see the properties themselves. The Christian Concert Ventures real estate wasn't the only vehicle. A second category of investment opportunity, tied to Christian concerts held in the Dominican Republic and in Colombia, extended the alleged scheme internationally. These ventures were pitched as additional faith-based opportunities connected to Garcia's broader ministry work, giving people already invested in the church-flipping projects, or people encountering Garcia for the first time, a second avenue to put money towards something that sounded like it served the church's mission. Specific dollar figures tied to the concert ventures alone aren't broken out in the available reporting, but the indictment names them right alongside the church-flipping schemes, part of the same broader pattern, projects wrapped in the language of ministry and funded by people who believed, reasonably enough given how they were pitched, that they were backing legitimate religious and cultural events overseas. The international reach of these ventures lines up neatly with the indictment's description of victims located both domestically and abroad, and it may well be part of how that international pool of investors got pulled in to begin with. The donations instruction. One of the more revealing details in the indictment isn't about what Garcia did with the money, it's about how he told victims to describe it after the fact. Rather than documenting transfers as business investments, Garcia allegedly instructed investors to label their payments as charitable donations to Gracia Church. That might sound like a minor paperwork distinction. It carries real legal and financial weight. A documented business investment creates a clear paper trail, one tying the recipient to an obligation, an expectation that something is owed back. A donation implies the opposite by definition, no expectation of repayment or profit at all. By steering victims toward that language on official records, while continuing to promise them returns and profits verbally behind the scenes, prosecutors allege Garcia built himself a convenient gray area, one that would make it far harder for victims to reclaim their money or even prove in court that a return had been promised, since their own paperwork said something different. There's a second effect worth flagging. On the church's own books, incoming money could be recorded as donations rather than investment liabilities. That distinction shapes two things at once: how outsiders reviewing the church's finances might perceive its health, and how difficult it becomes for any individual victim to prove what they were actually told. The Kenya mission trip solicitation. Among the schemes named in the indictment is one with nothing to do with real estate or overseas concerts, a proposed church mission trip to Kenya. Prosecutors appear to treat it as its own category, separate from the investment-style schemes described above. Garcia allegedly made false representations to raise money for this trip, typically around $2,000 per person, and the people who paid believed reasonably they were funding travel and mission work tied to their own church community, the kind of trip plenty of congregations organize without incident. But prosecutors allege something more troubling than a trip that simply fell through. They say Garcia knew, at the time he was collecting the money, that he would cancel these trips or never book them at all, and that the funds would go toward unrelated expenses instead. For the people who paid, that distinction changes everything about how the harm should be understood. This wasn't a legitimate plan that fell apart later. It was, according to the indictment, a solicitation built from the outset on a trip that was never going to happen. It also differs structurally from the real estate and concert ventures. No profit percentage got dangled here, no reinvestment story to maintain over time, just a shared sense of religious purpose and community trust, the simple assumption that money given for a mission trip goes toward that mission trip. That may be exactly why prosecutors singled it out separately in the indictment rather than folding it into the broader investment fraud narrative. The scale of the alleged fraud added all up, and more than 50 victims, located both in the United States and internationally, paid over $3.2 million to Garcia as a result of this scheme, prosecutors say. These weren't victims clustered around one congregation, one project, or one narrow window of time. They spanned multiple real estate deals across different Texas cities, concert ventures on 2 different continents, and the Kenya solicitation, all unfolding over nearly 4 years, from August 2021 through April 2025. And that money, according to prosecutors, ultimately covered Garcia's personal living expenses and unrelated business costs, not the renovations, concerts, or mission trips victims had actually been told they were funding. Statements from prosecutors. The U.S. Attorney's Office for the Northern District of Texas issued a public statement after the indictment came down, describing a scheme in which Garcia took advantage of his victims' faith, promised them significant profits through what looked like legitimate investment opportunities, and used their money for his own purposes instead. That statement previews the argument prosecutors are expected to make at trial. Garcia's standing as a pastor wasn't incidental to how this fraud worked. It was central to it. The trust that comes with a pastoral role is, in prosecutors' telling, exactly what allowed the scheme to function for as long as it did. The identity theft charge, explained 3 of the 4 counts, traced directly back to money taken from the 50-plus investors already discussed. The 4th, aggravated identity theft, stands apart, and it points to a victim entirely separate from that investor pool. Garcia allegedly used another person's name and address, without authorization, on business formation documents filed with the Texas Secretary of State. In practical terms, that means one of the entities used to receive victim funds, whether Ministerio Gracia, Gracia Church of Texas, or A Pesar de Todo LLC, was built in part using someone else's identity, someone who, according to the allegations, had no idea their name was being used to help establish part of this operation's legal infrastructure. That's a fundamentally different kind of harm than the fraud counts describe. The 50-plus investors made a choice, however deceived they were about what their money would fund. They knowingly handed it over. The person named in the identity theft charge made no such choice. According to the allegations, they had no contact with the scheme at all, no knowledge it existed. Their name was simply taken and used without consent to help the operation look legitimate on official filings. Why aggravated identity theft and not simple identity theft? Under federal law, the aggravated version applies specifically when someone's identity gets used in connection with, meaning during and as part of, another underlying federal felony. Here, prosecutors allege the identity theft occurred in direct connection with the wire fraud scheme. The stolen identity wasn't the endpoint of the crime. It was a tool, allegedly, used to help the broader fraud look credible. That distinction is a big part of why federal law treats it as a separate charge, stacked on top of the fraud counts rather than folded into them. Sentencing reflects that same logic. A conviction for aggravated identity theft carries a mandatory 2-year term, and by statute, that term runs consecutively, added on top of whatever sentence comes from the other counts rather than served alongside it. Convict Garcia on the wire fraud and conspiracy counts, and give him any term of years there, and the 2-year identity theft sentence still doesn't start until that other time has been fully served. This is part of why federal prosecutors often spotlight aggravated identity theft charges in cases built like this one. Mandatory, non-negotiable, and stacked on top of everything else. It functions as a guaranteed floor regardless of how the broader fraud counts resolve at sentencing. A jury could acquit on some or even all of the wire fraud counts, and Garcia could still face 2 mandatory years on the identity theft charge alone, a reflection of how seriously federal law treats identity used as a tool inside a larger crime. For a case built mostly around deception, fabricated profits, mislabeled donations, a mission trip that prosecutors say was never going to happen, the identity theft charge is different. It doesn't depend on proving what Garcia told his victims or promised them verbally. It rests on a paperwork trail instead, a name and address on a state filing that, according to the indictment, didn't belong there and had no permission to be there. That may make it the most straightforward count to prove at trial, since it comes down to documenting who filed what and whether they had the right to do it. What happens next? Garcia's case is moving through federal court in Fort Worth, with trial set for October. As with any indictment, these charges represent allegations prosecutors will need to prove beyond a reasonable doubt to a jury, and Garcia remains presumed innocent throughout that process. Conviction on the wire fraud and conspiracy counts would bring up to 20 years in prison on each one. A conviction on the identity theft charge would add a mandatory 2 years on top, running consecutively rather than concurrently. The FBI has also said it's looking for additional victims who may have been affected, and it's encouraging anyone who believes they lost money to Garcia's ventures to come forward. Conclusion. This is the case against Richard Reynaldo Garcia, a pastor federal prosecutors, alleged church renovation projects, international Christian concerts, and a mission trip to Kenya into vehicles for a $3.2 million fraud scheme spanning nearly 4 years and reaching more than 50 victims across the United States and abroad. Real estate deals with fabricated profit reports. Donation labels allegedly used to mask what were really investment promises. A fundraising push for a trip that, prosecutors say, was never going to happen. All of it built on entities carrying the language of ministry, one of which, according to prosecutors, was constructed in part using a stolen identity. Garcia has not been convicted of anything. His case will be tested in federal court, where a jury will weigh the evidence behind these allegations. But regardless of how the trial ends, the indictment offers a detailed look at how faith, financial promises, and church infrastructure can allegedly combine into a scheme reaching far beyond one congregation, into the finances of more than 50 people, plus one more, whose name was allegedly used without them ever knowing it happened.